The morning George Slater rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the spring of 1882, three grown men stepped off the wooden boardwalk and into the mud just to avoid crossing his path, and not a single soul in town thought that was unusual. He was not the tallest man in the territory, nor the broadest, though he was both of those things in considerable measure. What set George Slater apart from every other hard-bitten cowhand who drifted through the cattle towns of southern Kansas was something less tangible than size. It lived in the set of his jaw, the unhurried way his dark eyes moved across a room, the particular stillness he carried the way other men carried a sidearm, always present, always loaded. He had worked cattle drives up from Texas along the Kishom Trail for the better part of 8 years, and before that, he had done things he no longer spoke about in company. The ranch hands at the Barlow outfit, where he now served as foreman, had a dozen stories about him, each one worse than the last, and the remarkable thing was that at least half of them were true. He had once stared down a stampede of 400 longhorns by himself, standing in the open prairie with nothing but a coiled rope, until the lead steer broke and the herd turned. He had pulled a man named Deckard Holt out of a burning bunkhouse, not out of fondness. He had no great fondness for Deckard Holt, but simply because leaving a man to burn was not something he was willing to have on his ledger. He had settled a dispute between two ranch hands over a card game by picking up the table they were arguing across and setting it outside, and then standing in the doorway until both men decided they had nothing further to discuss. Nobody laughed. Nobody ever laughed when George Slater was involved. He was 29 years old, unmarried, and entirely unbothered by either of those facts, or so he told himself every morning when he pulled on his boots in the gray light before dawn. The Barlow Ranch sat 12 miles south of Caldwell, along a creek that ran brown and slow through flat grassland that stretched to the horizon in every direction. Old Henry Barlow had built the main house himself 20 years prior, a solid 2-story structure of hewn timber and limestone that had outlasted 2 grass fires, 1 catastrophic flood, and Henry Barlow himself, who had died of a heart seizure the previous November while arguing with his lawyer over land deeds. He left the ranch to his nephew, a thin young man named Preston Barlow who had grown up in St. Louis and had never roped a calf in his life, and who was perfectly sensible enough to know it. Preston arrived in March with a trunk full of city clothes and an earnest handshake, and his first act as the new owner of Barlow Ranch was to find George Slater and tell him that he intended to stay out of George's way entirely, which was the most intelligent thing any employer had ever said to George in his professional career. His second act was to write a letter to his late uncle's sister in Missouri, a widow named Sarah Redmond, informing her that the position of housekeeper and cook for the ranch, a position that old Henry had apparently promised her years ago, was still available if she wanted it. Sarah Redmond arrived on a Wednesday with 2 trunks, a cast-iron skillet she refused to let anyone else carry, and her daughter. George was out in the south pasture when they arrived, so he heard about it from Deckard Holt later that afternoon, delivered with a particular quality of smirk that George generally found irritating. "New cook came in today," Deckard said, leaning against the fence post while George checked the wire for brakes. "Woman named Redmond, widow, brought her daughter with her." George said nothing, which was his standard response to most things Deckard said. "Daughter's something," Deckard continued. "Name's Sarah, maybe 20-21, got red hair. Real red, not the kind that's sort of brown, the actual color. You plan on helping with this fence or just narrating my afternoon?" George said. Deckard grinned and picked up the wire cutters without further commentary. George did not think about the red hair for the rest of the afternoon. He was a man of exceptional discipline. He thought about it for approximately 2 minutes that evening while washing up at the pump behind the bunkhouse, and then he put it away with the firm efficiency of a man who had long practiced setting things on shelves in his mind where they would not trouble him. He was the foreman. She was the cook's daughter. The ranch had 12 hands who would spend the next 3 months making fools of themselves trying to impress her, and the last thing any of them needed was their foreman joining that particular parade. He walked into the main house for supper with his hat in his hand, and his expression set to its usual neutral authority, and that was when it happened. The long table in the Barlow dining room seated 14. Preston sat at the head, making conversation with Clara Redmond, who turned out to be a compact, capable-looking woman with gray-streaked hair, and the unhurried manner of someone accustomed to managing large households. The ranch hands were filing in, scrubbed to varying degrees of cleanliness, arranging themselves along the benches with the uncomfortable formality of men who knew they were being watched by someone new. George took his customary seat near the middle of the table, across from Deckard and 2 seats down from where Preston sat. He set his hat on the peg behind him, nodded once to the room, and sat down. The girl, Sarah Redmond, came out of the kitchen carrying a bowl of boiled potatoes in one hand and a platter of sliced beef in the other, moving with the brisk competence of someone who had been helping in kitchens since before she could see over the counter. She set the potatoes down, set the beef down, pushed a loose strand of hair back from her forehead with her wrist, and then looked up to find 12 ranch hands staring at her with the collective intensity of a congregation awaiting a sermon. She was not flustered by this. She looked back at them with a pair of clear gray eyes and the faintest suggestion of amusement at the corner of her mouth, as if she had seen this particular response before and had long since catalogued it under things that are not my problem. "There's biscuits coming," she said, and went back to the kitchen. 3 of the ranch hands exhaled simultaneously. George looked down at his plate and reached for the beef without comment. Supper proceeded normally enough. Clara Redmond was an excellent cook. The potatoes had been done properly, with butter and a little salt, and the beef was not the overcooked leather that Horace, their previous cook, had specialized in. Conversation moved around the table in the usual fashion, Preston asking questions about the spring branding schedule, Deckard holding court at his end about a horse he claimed to have seen running wild along the creek bottom that would be worth a fortune to catch. Sarah came and went from the kitchen, refilling the water pitcher, bringing out the biscuits, carrying off empty platters. She did not appear to be paying any particular attention to any one person at the table, which George noted with the precise detachment of a man cataloging information he did not intend to use, was a rare quality in someone her age in a room full of men trying very hard to be noticed. Then she stopped beside George to set down the salt cellar, a small glass thing that had been at the far end of the table, and she looked at him directly and said, in a perfectly ordinary tone, as if she were speaking to anyone at all, "Would you pass the salt, please? I can't reach from here." George Slater, who had stared down a stampede of 400 longhorns who had walked into a burning building, who had built a reputation across 3 territories as a man who did not rattle for any reason that had ever been invented, reached for the salt cellar and nearly dropped it. His fingers caught it a half-inch above the table, steadied, and handed it to her. She took it, said thank you, and went back to the kitchen without a backward glance. The entire exchange lasted 4 seconds. George looked at his plate. He was aware, with a specificity that was thoroughly unwelcome, that his pulse had done something unusual. He was also aware that Deckard Holt was looking at him from across the table with an expression that suggested he had witnessed every fraction of those 4 seconds and intended to derive considerable entertainment from them for the foreseeable future. George picked up his fork. "Not a word," he said quietly, without looking up. Deckard pressed his lips together and looked at the ceiling. The next morning George was up before first light, which was normal, and he worked the horses hard until mid-morning, which was also normal, and he did not think once about gray eyes or the color of hair or the particular quality of a voice that said ordinary things in a way that made them sound like they mattered. This was mostly true. By the time the noon bell rang from the cookhouse, he had made a decision. He was the foreman of Barlow Ranch. He had 11 men depending on him to set the example. He was not the sort of man who went soft over a woman he had spoken 4 words to, and he was not going to become that sort of man now. He would be civil, professional, and distant, and the whole business would sort itself out in the natural way of things. He walked into the cookhouse for the midday meal with this resolution firmly in place. Sarah was at the long worktable cutting cornbread into squares. She looked up when he came in, and she gave him the same small, frank nod she appeared to give everyone, neither more nor less warm, and George thought, "Good, this will be fine. Sit wherever you like," she said. "Food's almost ready." "I usually stand until the hands come in," George said, which was true. "Make sure there's no trouble at the door." She raised an eyebrow in a way that managed to say, without any unkindness, that she thought this was a slightly unusual approach to eating lunch. "There's trouble at the door often." "Not usually. That's generally why." She almost smiled. Not quite. She went back to cutting the cornbread. George stood near the door and felt with some irritation that his resolution was already developing structural weaknesses. The hands came in over the next 10 minutes in groups of 2 and 3, moving past George with the careful awareness that men had around their foreman, finding seats, pulling off hats. Deckard came in last, looked at George standing by the door, looked at Sarah at the table, and had the self-preservation to keep his expression entirely neutral. Lunch was cornbread and a bean soup that was better than anything Horace had ever produced. George ate quickly, returned his bowl to the wash basin, and went back to work. He did this for 3 days running. He was efficient and purposeful, and he said exactly what needed to be said and nothing more. He was, he believed, handling the situation admirably. On the 4th day, he came in for supper to find that the bench on his side of the table was full, and the only open seat was across from Preston at the end, next to where Sarah sat down after serving to eat her own supper with the household. He sat down. She passed him the biscuits without being asked, because she appeared to have already memorized what everyone at the table preferred, and he said thank you, and she said you're welcome, and that was 3 complete sentences between them, which was more than he had managed in 4 days of determined avoidance. Preston, who was 24 and guileless in the particular way of someone who had received a good education, and consequently understood that other people often had interior lives of considerable complexity, looked between the two of them and said conversationally, "Sarah, Mr. Slater has been running this ranch since before my uncle passed. He knows every acre of it. If you ever want to see the country, I'm sure he'd be willing to show you around." There was a brief silence. George looked at Preston with an expression that communicated several things simultaneously, none of them hostile but all of them clear. Preston, to his credit, did not wilt. He simply looked back with the mild, open expression of a man who believed he had made a perfectly reasonable social suggestion. "That's kind," Sarah said, looking at George with the same frank steadiness she brought to everything, "though I don't want to take him away from his work." "I do take mornings off occasionally," George heard himself say. He was aware that his mouth had gotten slightly ahead of his intentions. "Saturday mornings," Deckard offered helpfully from down the table. "He doesn't usually ride until after 8 on Saturdays." George looked at Deckard. Deckard studied the ceiling again. "Saturday would be fine," Sarah said, and smiled the full version this time, not the almost smile she had been deploying all week, and George looked back at his plate and thought, "Well, there goes the resolution." Saturday came with a blue sky and a wind from the south that smelled like grass and distant rain, and George was at the stable at 7:30 telling himself he was simply being prompt, which was a quality he valued in all professional contexts. Sarah arrived at 5 minutes to 8 wearing a brown riding skirt and a pale blue shirtwaist, with her red hair braided and pinned back from her face, and carrying a canvas bag over one shoulder that clinked softly when she walked. George looked at the bag. "Sketching things," she said, which answered the question he had not asked. "I draw. Mostly landscapes, but I've been wanting to see the territory properly." He saddled a mare named Copper for her, a steady, good-natured animal that would not spook at anything short of a cannon, and his own horse, a big gray gelding named Amos who had been with him for 4 years and had the temperament of a philosopher. They rode south along the creek for the first half-hour mostly in silence, which George found comfortable rather than awkward, and which Sarah appeared to find equally acceptable. She was a good rider, he noticed, not flashy, not tentative, simply competent, the kind of competence that came from having done something practical since childhood. When they reached the low bluff above the creek bend, where the land opened up to show 30 miles of flat Kansas grassland rolling away under the enormous sky, she stopped Copper and looked out for a long moment without speaking. "Lord," she said softly, "most people from back east say something similar." "I'm from Missouri," she said. "We have hills and trees." She looked out at the grass. "It's different than I expected, not smaller, bigger. I thought flat would feel smaller." "It goes the other way," George said. She was already pulling the canvas bag around and opening it, extracting a small sketchbook and a stick of charcoal wrapped in paper. George held Copper's reins while she found a flat rock to sit on and opened the book, and he stood a little apart and watched the country, which was what he usually did from this spot, and which was easier than watching her draw, because watching her draw made him think things he was not entirely prepared to think. After a while she said, without looking up from the sketchbook, "You've been foreman here how long?" 3 years. Worked the drive up from Texas before that. 8 years on the Kishom Trail, give or take. That's a hard life." "It is." "You prefer it to the ranch?" He thought about that honestly. "No," he said, "I prefer the ranch. The trail is work and movement and not much else. Here there's something to build." She looked up then, and he found her watching him with the same attentive gray eyes, but with a different quality in them than he had seen before, something more careful, more genuinely curious. "That's not what I expected you to say," she said. "What did you expect?" "Something about freedom." Cowboys usually say something about freedom when you ask them why they do what they do. "I'm not much for speeches," George said. "No," she agreed and looked back at the sketchbook, and he could see from where he stood that she was smiling. "I noticed." They rode for 3 hours, covering the creek bottom and the south pasture and the long rise toward the Barlow property line where the fence posts marched away into the distance. She stopped twice more to sketch, once for a group of cattle standing in the creek shallows, and once for the fence line itself, which she seemed to find geometrically interesting. George stood near her each time and found that standing near her was becoming, with every passing minute, one of the things he most wanted to do, which was an observation he filed carefully under things requiring further consideration. On the ride back, she asked him about the cattle, and he told her breeds, numbers, the spring branding schedule, the way prices had been running at the Caldwell market. She listened with genuine attention, asking questions that were more specific than he expected, and he found himself talking more freely than he usually did, the words coming out with less effort than they required in most conversations. "Your mother's done this kind of work before," he said, because it was something he had been wondering. "Running a big household." "All her life," Sarah said. "She kept house for my father's family in Missouri, and then for my father, and then after he died for whoever would hire her." She paused. "She's good at it. She deserves a proper position, not just hired out cleaning." "She'll have that here," George said. "Preston won't give her trouble." "I know," Sarah said. "He seems kind." A pause. "You seem less kind." George looked at her, surprised into something close to actual amusement. "I've been told." "But you're not, are you?" she said, looking at him directly. "You're just careful. You think about things before you do them. That's not the same as unkind." He did not have an answer for that. He rode in silence for a moment, aware that she had just described him more accurately in 2 sentences than most people managed in years of acquaintance, and that this was either very comfortable or very dangerous, or possibly both. "You're perceptive," he said finally. "My mother says I notice too much," Sarah said pleasantly. "She says it'll get me in trouble one day." She might be right. Sarah laughed, a real one, clear and sudden, the kind that you don't plan, and George felt it somewhere in the vicinity of his chest, which he thought was a significant and alarming development. That evening he sat outside the bunkhouse for a while after the other men had gone in, looking at the stars, which were extravagant over the Kansas plain, and he had a long, honest conversation with himself about the state of things. He was 29. He had spent the better part of a decade moving and not settling, building competence and reputation, and a very effective wall around anything that could be called a personal life. He had told himself for years that this suited him. He had told himself this with such consistency that he had largely stopped examining whether it was true. The problem with Sarah Redmond was not that she was beautiful, though she was. The problem was that she was clear. She said what she meant and meant what she said, and she looked at him like she could see past the wall without particularly trying. And she had laughed at the thing. He said the way people only laughed when something struck them as genuinely funny rather than politely amusing. And he had been keeping his own company for long enough that he had forgotten what that felt like. He went to bed and stared at the bunkhouse ceiling and thought, this is going to complicate things considerably. Over the following weeks, the ranch moved into the full thrust of its spring work branding, sorting, fence repair, the endless maintenance that a property of this size demanded. George threw himself into it with the focused energy that had always been his strongest professional quality, rising before dawn and working until the light gave out. The hands moved through their days with the efficient rhythm he set, and the ranch functioned as it was supposed to function. And Sarah Redmond moved through the main house and the cookhouse and the yard with the same brisk competence she brought to everything. And she and George spoke every day, and each conversation was longer than the last. And the other ranch hands noticed this the way people who live in close quarters notice everything. And a particular theory began to develop among them that they were all too sensible to discuss within George's earshot. Deckard discussed it with Pete Mallory, the youngest hand on the outfit, who was 19 and had an incurable habit of stating obvious things. He likes her, Pete said, eating a piece of cornbread on the fence rail. I am aware, Deckard said. Does she like him? Deckard thought about this. He had spent 20 years around men and women in difficult circumstances, and he had developed what he considered a reasonably accurate sense of human behavior. Yes, he said, but she's sensible about it. She's not going to make it easy. Pete considered this. Should someone tell him that? Pete, Deckard said patiently, if you tell George Slater how to approach a woman, you will spend the next 6 months fixing fence posts in the north pasture by yourself. I guarantee it. Pete ate his cornbread in thoughtful silence. The thing that changed the pace of everything was the water dispute. The Barlow Ranch shared a southern boundary with a property called the Cutter Spread, owned by a man named Virgil Cutter who had arrived in Sumner County 3 years prior, and whose approach to neighboring ranches was roughly equivalent to his approach to everything else in life, which was to take as much as he thought he could get away with, and then try for a little more. He had been diverting creek water through a cut he'd made in the bank the previous fall, routing it onto his own pasture in a way that reduced the flow to the Barlow land enough to matter, and the winter had been dry enough that by May it was becoming a genuine problem. George had ridden out to talk to Cutter twice, both times civilly, and both times Cutter had been polite in the superficial way of a man who has already decided not to change what he's doing. The second time, Cutter had sent a hired hand named Briggs to deliver his response, which was that the creek ran where it ran, and if Barlow land was dry, that was God's business and not his. George brought this to Preston, who took it seriously, and they rode together to Caldwell to see the county judge about the water rights documentation. This was the first week of June. They were gone 2 days. On the second day, Sarah's mother Clara slipped on the wet kitchen floor and broke her wrist, and by the time George and Preston rode back into the yard, Sarah had been running the entire household operation solo for 36 hours on top of caring for her mother. and she was standing in the cookhouse yard when they arrived with her sleeves rolled to her elbows and flour on her forearms, and a look on her face that was the particular expression of someone who is completely fine, but would welcome the end of this particular situation at any reasonable point in the near future. George was off his horse before Preston had fully dismounted. "What happened?" he said, because he could read a situation, and this one read plainly. "Mama fell," she said. "Her wrist is broken. Doc Hedges came out from Caldwell yesterday and said it. She's resting." She paused. "I've been managing." "I can see that," George said. He looked at the cookhouse, then back at her. "What do you need?" She blinked. He got the impression this was not the question she had expected. "I need someone to carry the water for the morning, because those buckets are heavy and I've been doing it on my own, and it's slowing down the breakfast schedule." "Deckard," George said, without raising his voice but at a volume that carried. Deckard materialized from the direction of the stable as if he had been waiting. "Yeah, boss. Water duty starting tomorrow morning, early." Deckard looked briefly at Sarah and then at George and said, "Sure thing," with a complete absence of the smirk George had been expecting, and went away again. Sarah was looking at George with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. It was softer than her usual directness. "Thank you," she said. "How's your mother really doing?" She leaned against the cookhouse doorframe, and some of the brisk competence went out of her posture, replaced by something more honest and tired. "She's in pain. She won't admit it. She's already talking about how she'll be back at the stove in a week, which is not going to happen." "She won't need to rush," George said. "We can manage." "She worries," Sarah said. "She's always worried about her position. If she can't work, nobody's losing their position over a broken wrist," George said, with a flatness that was not harsh but left no room for argument. "Preston's not that kind of man, and I'm not that kind of foreman." She looked at him for a long moment, and the tiredness in her face was replaced by something that might have been relief, or might have been something warmer than that, or was probably both at once. "You're doing it again," she said quietly. "What?" "Being kind," she said, "while trying to look like you're just being practical." He looked at her. She looked at him. The late afternoon light was golden and long across the yard, and somewhere in the pasture Amos was moving through the grass with the slow satisfaction of a horse who knew he was done for the day, and the wind was warm and smelled like June. "I'll carry the water myself tomorrow," George said. "You don't need to wait for Deckard." She smiled at him then, the full version, the one that did what it had done to him the first time, and said, "I'll have coffee ready at 5. He was at the pump at 5 o'clock the next morning in the gray pre-dawn with the buckets, and she was at the cookhouse door with 2 cups of coffee, and they stood in the quiet early morning and drank the coffee while the sky went from gray to pink to the clear hard blue of a Kansas summer day, and they talked. They talked about Missouri and about Texas, and about what it was like to grow up on the trail versus growing up in a house, and about books. She read extensively, had a small collection of novels that she kept wrapped in cloth in the bottom of her trunk, and about her father, who had died when she was 16 of the fever that had come through their county, leaving her mother with nothing but the house and Sarah, and 10 years of practical domestic skill that turned out to be worth considerably more than a house. "Do you miss Missouri?" George asked. She wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at the sunrise. "I miss having somewhere that felt permanent," she said. "Missouri never quite felt like ours. After Papa died, everything we had was borrowed somehow. This is different. I think this could be a place." She paused. "Does that sound foolish?" "No," he said. "It sounds like something I understand." She looked at him. "Have you never had a place, a home place?" "Not since I was a boy," he said. "After my mother died, my father and I moved around, worked cattle. It became habit." "Is that what you want, to keep moving?" He was quiet for a moment. The sun was fully up now, burning the dew off the grass in thin white wisps. "No," he said. "I haven't wanted to keep moving for a while. He stopped." "Haven't had a reason to stop," she said. He looked at her. She was watching the sunrise, not him, as if she were being careful not to make the question too direct, giving him room to answer it without feeling cornered. "Something like that," he said. They stood in the quiet for a while longer, finishing the coffee, and then the day started and they went to their separate work. And George spent the morning writing fence lines with a particular quality of focused attention that had nothing at all to do with fence lines. And he thought, I am 30 yards past the point of no return on this, and I have been for weeks, and I might as well stop pretending otherwise. The water dispute with Cutter came to a head in the second week of June, in a way that George had been quietly anticipating and hoping to avoid. He and two hands, Deckard, and a steady older man named Calvin Reed, rode down to the south boundary to check the creek bank, and they found two of Cutter's men, Briggs and another hand George didn't know, actively at work widening the cut in the bank with shovels. George stopped Amos 20 yards out and said, in a voice that carried clearly across the distance, "Put the shovels down." Briggs looked up with the careful expression of a man gauging odds. He was a broad, thick fellow who had probably intimidated a significant number of people in his time, and he was currently holding a shovel and standing with a companion and looking at 3 riders, and George watched him do the calculation. "Cutter's land," Briggs said. "Cutter's bank." "That bank feeds the Barlow Creek," George said. "Judge Harlan issued a ruling on this yesterday. Water rights documentation says the flow is shared. You widen that cut any further, you're in violation of a county order." "I don't have a paper that says that." "No," George agreed. "But you'll have one by Friday, because that's when the county marshal will be delivering it. What you decide to do with your shovels between now and then will determine whether we also have a conversation about willful destruction of water easements." He paused. "You can explain that to Cutter, or I can, your choice." Briggs stared at him for a long moment. The other man had quietly set his shovel down and taken a half step back, which George noted as a reasonable decision. "Cutter's not going to like this," Briggs said. "Cutter can come talk to me," George said pleasantly. "I'll be here most mornings." Briggs and his companion left. George rode the bank for another hour, documented the width of the cut in a notebook he carried for this purpose, and then rode back to report to Preston, who had the good sense to immediately send another letter to Judge Harlan's office. He did not tell Sarah about this until that evening, when he found her sitting on the back step of the main house in the cool dusk with a book in her lap and a glass of water beside her, and he sat on the step below hers. It was a wide step. There was room, and told her what had happened, because he had discovered over the past weeks that telling her things was one of the more satisfying activities available to him, and she told him that he had handled it correctly, and then she said, with a slight hesitation that he noticed because he had become expert at noticing her hesitations, "You weren't in any danger." "Briggs is big," George said. "He's not stupid." He calculated the numbers and decided against it. But if he had decided differently, he didn't. But if he had, George looked at her. She was looking at him with a directness that was slightly different from her usual directness, and he recognized it after a moment as something closer to worry than anything else he had seen from her. "I've been in difficult situations before," he said carefully. "I try to make sure they don't become violent ones." "Try," she repeated. "Sarah." She closed her book and set it on her knee and looked at him with those gray eyes and said, with the frankness that was always there but with something more open behind it now, "I'm aware that I don't have the right to worry about you. We've been speaking for less than 2 months, but I find that I do, regardless, and I thought that was worth saying." He looked at her for a long moment. The sky above the ranch had gone deep blue and the first stars were appearing, and somewhere a cricket had started its evening work, and the grass moved in the warm June wind, and George Slater, who had spent the better part of a decade being certain about everything, felt with absolute clarity that this was one of the most significant moments of his adult life. "You have the right," he said. She went still. "Do I?" "Yes," he said. "You do." She looked at him for a long time, and then she looked down at the book in her lap, and he saw the slight smile that she was trying to contain, and he felt the thing in his chest that had been quietly building for 6 weeks settle into something warm and certain and permanent. "Well," she said, and there was a softness in the word that he thought about for a very long time after. That's good to know. He did not kiss her that evening. He was not the kind of man who moved fast on things that mattered, and this mattered more than anything had in his memory, and he wanted to be sure. But he sat there on the step with her until the stars were fully out, and they talked about small things. A book she was reading, the disposition of a horse in the North pasture, what Missouri summers were like. And the talking was different now, warmer, with the particular ease of two people who have said something true to each other and found the ground solid on the other side. Clara Redmond's wrist healed with the steady persistence that characterized her approach to setbacks, and by the end of June, she was back at work with her arm in a cloth sling, arguing with the limitation in a way that suggested she would be sling-free within the week regardless of what Doc Hedges recommended. She was a sharp woman who missed very little, and she had been watching her daughter and George Slater with the patient attention of a mother who has learned that direct commentary is less effective than simply waiting for the sensible conclusion. She cornered George one morning in the cookhouse doorway with 2 cups of coffee, extended one to him, and said, without preamble, "My daughter is 22 years old and she is sensible and capable, and she has spent the last several years looking after me when it should have been the other way around." George accepted the coffee and waited. "I am not telling you what to do," Clara said. "I am simply informing you that she deserves someone who knows what he wants and is willing to say so without spending 3 months deciding whether it's convenient." "Yes, ma'am," George said. Clara nodded, satisfied, and went back to her kitchen. He took the message in the spirit in which it was intended. 2 days later, on a Sunday afternoon when most of the hands were resting, and Preston had ridden to Caldwell for supplies, George found Sarah behind the main house in the kitchen garden, which she had planted herself in her first weeks at the ranch. A tidy rectangle of turned earth with beans and squash coming up in neat rows, and the beginnings of what would be tomatoes along the south-facing fence. She was kneeling in the dirt, examining the bean plants with the focused care she brought to anything growing, and she looked up when she heard his footsteps and shaded her eyes against the afternoon sun. He stood at the edge of the garden and said, without the elaborate preamble he had been rehearsing for 2 days, "I want to ask you to walk out with me properly, not just riding the property, as a courtship, if that's something you'd want." She sat back on her heels and looked at him with those clear gray eyes, and the June sun was on her red hair and there was dirt on her hands, and she said, "I've been waiting for you to ask that for about 3 weeks. He raised an eyebrow. "You're slow," she said. "I say that fondly," he almost smiled. "I'm careful." "You are," she agreed. "It's one of the things I like about you." She stood, brushed the dirt from her hands on her apron, and looked at him steadily. "Yes, George, I would like that very much." They walked that evening, south along the creek in the late gold light, and he offered her his arm and she took it, and they talked in the easy, unhurried way they had developed, and it was different now in the way that everything is different when the unnamed thing has been named larger, cleaner, more honest. He told her things he did not generally tell people. About his father, who had been a good man but a restless one, who had taught him the cattle work and very little else, and had died of a fever in Texas when George was 19, leaving him alone in a territory he was still learning to navigate. About the early years on the drive, when he had been young and hard, and had made a reputation partly through skill and partly through the willingness to back his position with whatever was necessary, and about the slow and deliberate decision he had made somewhere around year 4 that the reputation was not the man and need not be. About what he wanted, which was simple and which had been clear to him for years but which had remained theoretical for lack of a specific application. A piece of land, a real home, something that was his and permanent and worthy of being cared for. "I've been saving," he said. "For 7 years I have enough for a start, not a large operation but enough land and enough stock to begin with." She looked at him. "You've been planning to leave Barlow Ranch." "Not leave in a hurry, when the time was right." He paused. "I haven't known what right looked like until recently." She was quiet for a moment, watching the creek. "Is that, are you telling me this because you want me to know what you're thinking about the future?" "Yes," he said simply. She was quiet again. "Then I have nothing to bring to that. My mother and I have what we earn. No property, no savings to speak of." "I'm not asking you to bring property," he said. "I'm asking you to think about whether that kind of future sounds like something you'd want." She stopped walking. He stopped beside her. The creek moved past them, brown and gentle, and the grass was tall on the banks, and the sky was enormous and pink and gold above the flat land. "George Slater," she said, and her voice had something in it that was not quite laughter and not quite tears but was somewhere precise between them. "Are you asking me to consider whether I'd like to marry you someday, while standing in a creek bottom in Kansas at sunset?" "I suppose I am," he said. She looked at him with the gray eyes, and then she laughed the clear, real laugh, the one that did the thing, and she took his hand. Not his arm this time, but his actual hand, her fingers interlacing with his with the decisiveness that characterized everything she did, and she said, "I think I would like that very much. Someday." He looked at her hand in his and thought that he had held onto quite a few things in his life, ropes and reins and tools and the worn grip of work, and none of them had felt as right as this. "Not too far off someday," he said. "Not too far off," she agreed. July on the Barlow Ranch was the hardest working month of the summer, and George drove his hands and himself through it with the focused energy that had always been his professional hallmark. But there was something different in the driving now, something with a direction to it, and the men felt it and responded to it, and the ranch operated with a smoothness that even Preston noticed and commented on with genuine appreciation. George and Sarah walked most evenings. Sometimes they rode on Sunday mornings. They sat together at supper when the seating allowed, and she poured his coffee first in the mornings, which was a small thing and entirely consistent with the order she always poured, but which George was aware of with a specificity he did not examine too closely. He helped her carry the heavy kitchen things when he was in the yard, and she kept a piece of cornbread aside for him on late evenings when the work ran long, and these were the small domestic adjustments of two people who have quietly, with the minimum of fuss, become essential to each other. Deckard observed all of this and said nothing. This was the greatest act of personal discipline Deckard Holt had ever performed, and he deserved significant credit for it. The Cutter situation resolved in early July when the county marshal did indeed deliver the court order, and Cutter, being a man of limited vision but not unlimited stupidity, calculated the cost of defying a county judge and decided it was not worth it. The cut in the bank was partially filled, the creek flow restored to something reasonable, and George rode the south boundary on a hot July morning and confirmed it, and felt the particular satisfaction of a problem resolved through patience and the correct application of legal pressure rather than anything messier. He wrote it all down in the notebook. He kept dates, actions, outcomes, a habit his father had actually instilled in him, and one of the more useful inheritances. He had kept the habit for 20 years, and the notebooks were stored in a box under his bunk, a record of every significant operation he had worked and every significant thing he had done, which was a kind of private history that no one else had ever read and that he had never particularly wanted to share. He mentioned the notebooks to Sarah one evening, and she looked at him with a bright interest that he had come to recognize as the particular expression she wore when something caught her curiosity, and she said, "Can I read them someday?" "They're not interesting," he said. "Mostly fence repairs and cattle counts." "And other things," she said, because she had heard enough about his history to know the notebooks held more than inventory. "And other things," he allowed. "Someday," she said. "Someday," he agreed. He brought one to her the next Sunday, one of the earlier ones from the Texas years, sitting beside her on the main house steps while she read it with the focused attention she brought to reading anything, making small sounds occasionally of interest or surprise or something that might have been sympathy when she reached the part about his father's death. When she finished, she held the book in her lap and was quiet for a while. "You were so young," she said, "when all of this happened to you. 19, 20. It was a long time ago. It made you who you are, she said, which is not the same as a long time ago. He looked at her. She was watching the yard, the notebook held in both hands, and she had the expression she wore when she was being careful, saying something important but giving him room with the way she held it. "Does that concern you?" he asked. "Who I am?" "No," she said immediately, turning to look at him directly. "I think who you are is George. I think you're the best man I've ever known. And I don't mean in the sense of impressive, though you are that. I mean in the sense of good. You're a genuinely good person who doesn't make a production of it, and you've had a hard life, and you're neither bitter nor broken. And I find all of that." She stopped, and the slight color that came into her face sometimes when she said something that surprised even herself was visible now. "I find all of that very much worth loving," she finished quietly. The evening had gone still and warm around them. George looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, equally quietly, "I love you, Sarah." She looked at him and the gray eyes were bright, and she said, "I know, I've known for a while," and then, as if that honesty required matching, "I love you too, I have for some time." He took her hand, which was becoming his preferred response to things that mattered too much for words, and she leaned her shoulder against his, and they sat there in the warm July evening watching the last of the light leave the sky. He had a ring within the month. He had known what he wanted to do from July onwards, and in August, when he rode into Caldwell for supplies, he stopped at the small jeweler's establishment on Main Street, which was run by a quiet German man named Werner, who had been making and repairing jewelry on the Kansas frontier for 15 years, and who produced from his back case a simple gold band with a small oval of garnet. He called it a Bohemian garnet set in it, and said it had come in 3 months prior, and he had been wondering who it was for. George looked at it and said, "This one." He asked her on a Thursday evening in August, in the kitchen garden, which had been her choice of place to spend her evenings, and which had grown through the summer into something substantial and tended, and unmistakably hers. The beans tall and producing, the squash enormous, the tomatoes coming into red abundance. He had been carrying the ring in his vest pocket for 3 days, waiting for the right moment, and the right moment, he had discovered, was any quiet moment when he was alone with her and the light was good, which described approximately every evening. He did not make a speech. That was not who he was, and she knew it and would not have wanted it. He took the ring out of his pocket and held it out and said, "I have the land picked out, 12 miles west of here along the second branch of the creek. The deed's available. I can close on it this fall." She looked at the ring and then at him, and the expression on her face was something he had not quite seen before, a fullness, an opening, as if something had been held carefully closed for a long time and had finally been given permission to be larger. "Yes," she said. "George, yes." He put the ring on her finger, which fit as if Werner had known after all, and she looked at it for a moment with the particular attention she gave things she wanted to memorize. And then she looked up at him, and he kissed her for the first time, there in the kitchen garden in the August evening, and it was as clean and certain and right as everything else about her had always been. Clara Redmond cried when Sarah told her, which she would have denied if anyone had mentioned it, and Preston shook George's hand with genuine warmth and said that he was very glad, and also that he would need to start looking for a new foreman eventually. But that eventually could mean whatever George needed it to mean. Deckard heard the news at breakfast the next morning and said, "Well, it's about time," and then caught George's eye and added, "I say that with the utmost respect, boss," and George said, "Good morning, Deckard," and ate his eggs, and the table was happier than it had been in a long time. They were married in September, in the small frame church in Caldwell, on a Saturday morning when the weather was perfect, warm but not hot, the sky the deep October-adjacent blue that Kansas gets in September, the air clear and carrying the faint smell of autumn. The church was not large, but it was full. Most of the Barlow hands, Preston, Clara, who wore her good dress and managed to be dignified for the entire ceremony, except for the moment George put the ring on Sarah's finger, at which point she stopped pretending. Werner the jeweler was there. Judge Harlan was there, Doc Hedges and his wife. 3 families from neighboring homesteads who had come to know Sarah over the summer's casual acquaintance and had developed a warm regard for her. Sarah wore a dress that her mother and 2 of the homesteader women had helped her make over the previous 3 weeks, ivory cotton with a high collar and small buttons down the front, simply cut, absolutely right for who she was. Her red hair was up but not severely, and she carried 3 late summer wildflowers from the creek bottom, because she had wanted those and not anything bought, and she walked to the front of the church with her hand on her mother's arm and looked at George standing at the altar and smiled at him with the smile that still did what it had always done, and he thought he was the luckiest man in the territory. He was not wrong. The minister was a young man named Aldrich who conducted the ceremony with earnest sincerity, and when he came to the vows, he gave them the traditional words, and both George and Sarah spoke them with the particular gravity of 2 people who do not say things they do not mean. And the church was very quiet during the speaking of them, as if everyone present understood that something real was happening, and it deserved the silence. They rode to the reception, which was held at the Barlow Ranch, in Preston's spring wagon decorated by Clara with cut grass and late flowers, and the ranch hands had strung lanterns from the fence posts, and Clara and 2 of the neighboring women had produced a table of food that represented the serious effort of several days, and someone had brought a fiddle, and there was dancing in the yard when the light was gone and the lanterns were lit. George danced with Sarah twice, which was twice more than he had danced with anyone in the previous 10 years, and she taught him the second dance in the middle of the yard with patient instruction and no small amount of laughter when he got it wrong, and he got it wrong twice on purpose for the sake of the laugh. Deckard danced with Sarah Redmond and appeared to find this arrangement considerably to his liking, which nobody commented on directly but everyone noticed. The night was warm and the stars were out and the lanterns moved in the gentle wind, and George stood with Sarah's hand in his under the Kansas sky and looked at his life and thought that he had not known, at 19 and alone in Texas, that things could arrive at this particular fullness. He was glad he had not known, because the not knowing had been part of what had brought him here to this ranch, to this yard, to this woman. He told her this quietly, standing apart from the dancing for a moment. She looked up at him and said, "I'm glad you ended up in Caldwell." "So am I," he said. They spent their first weeks of married life in 2 rooms in the main house that Preston had insisted on, as he had a dozen rooms and was using 6 of them at best. And George and Sarah were practical and quiet about the arrangements and deeply, privately happy. She continued to help her mother in the kitchen, because the work needed doing and because she was who she was, and George rose before dawn and ran the ranch and came in for supper and sat beside his wife at the long table, and the small daily fact of this, her beside him, passing the bread, asking about the day, listening to the answers, was more than he had known to want. They spent Sunday mornings writing, sometimes with the sketchbook and sometimes without, and she showed him the drawings she had made over the summer, and he looked at them with an attentive seriousness that she said was better than any compliment, and he told her that the drawing of the longhorns in the creek was the best of them, and she disagreed and showed him why, and he conceded the point. The land he had chosen, 12 miles west along the second branch of the creek, closed in October. He and Preston rode out to see it together, and Preston, who was becoming less the uncertain young man from St. Louis with every passing month and more the owner of a working ranch, looked at the lay of the land with the learned eye he had been developing and said, "It's good land, George. It's really good land." It was 240 acres of mixed grass and creek bottom, with a low rise in the northwest corner that gave a long view of the surrounding country and a stand of cottonwoods along the water that provided shade and building material. There was no house yet. There would be. He broke the news to Sarah that evening, and she listened to his description of every acre with the concentrated attention that never failed to move him, and when he was done she said, "When do we start building?" "Spring," he said. I want to get through the winter in good shape financially first, and construction goes better in spring. I can start the foundation work in March." She nodded. "I want a kitchen with a south-facing window," she said, "and I want to put a garden in the first spring." "South-facing window," he confirmed, and filed it alongside everything else he was carrying carefully, all the things that mattered. The winter came down hard across southern Kansas in December of 1882, the way it had a habit of doing, sudden and serious, with a blue norther that drove the temperature down 30 degrees in an afternoon and left a foot of snow on the ground by morning. The cattle gathered in the low places, and the hands worked the cold with gloved hands and gritted teeth, breaking ice in the water troughs and feeding hay from the stacks they had built through the fall. George worked the cold with everyone else, which was part of why the men worked it with him. A foreman who sat inside while the hands froze earned nothing, and he had always understood this. He came in the evening stiff with cold, and Sarah would have coffee ready and sometimes a pan of something warm on the back of the stove, and he would sit at the kitchen table with his hands around the cup, and she would sit across from him, and they would talk quietly about the day and the work and whatever was on their minds. And the warmth of this was not only the stove. He told her about a hand named Julio Mendez, one of the Mexican cowboys who had come up from Texas the previous spring, and who was among the best horsemen on the ranch, but who encountered a specific friction from two of the other hands. A low, grinding kind of prejudice that expressed itself in the way certain men spoke about certain other men when they thought the foreman was not listening. George was always listening. He had spoken to those two hands privately and directly, and there had been no recurrence, but it sat with him. "It's wrong," Sarah said simply. "What they said." "Yes," George agreed. "Did you tell them it was wrong?" "I told them I wouldn't have it on my crew," he said. "Whether they understood why is their business. The behavior stops either way." She was quiet for a moment. "Julio's a good man," she said. She had seen him around the yard, spoken to him occasionally, offered the same frank courtesy she offered everyone. "He brings his work as seriously as anyone." "More seriously than most," George said. "I'm glad you handled it," she said. "Some men wouldn't." "Some men are wrong," George said, and drank his coffee. She looked at him across the kitchen table, her chin in her hand, the lamplight warm on her face, and said, "You know what I thought when I first saw you." "What?" "I thought there is a man who has a great deal of force in him and is using it mostly to keep people away." She paused. "I wanted to know what was inside the fence." "And now you know," he said. "And now I know," she agreed. "It was worth the curiosity." He reached across the table and took her hand, which was right there, which was always right there now, and she turned her hand to hold his, and the wind was loud against the kitchen window, and outside the snow was deep and the stars were hidden, but in here the lamp was steady and the coffee was warm and everything was exactly as it should be. In February, Sarah told him she was pregnant. She told him at breakfast on a Tuesday with the brisk directness that characterized all her important announcements. No build-up, no circling, just the facts stated clearly with her gray eyes on him to see how he took it. He sat with the information for a moment. Then he said, "Are you well?" "I'm fine," she said. "Tired in the mornings, but fine." He got up from the table and went around to her side, and he held her face in his hands, which were work-roughened and probably cold. And he looked at her for a long moment, and he said, "I'm so glad," in a voice that was quieter than his usual voice, and she put her hands over his and said, "Me too." Clara, when told, was composed for approximately 45 seconds before embracing her daughter and then turning to George and saying, in the particular tone mothers reserve for men they have approved of, "Good. You'll be a fine father." George received this solemnly, and with the understanding that it was both a compliment and an instruction. Construction on the new house began in March, as planned. George had drawn up the layout himself over the winter, not an elaborate house, but a well-built one designed to last and to function. 2 stories, a kitchen with a south-facing window. 3 bedrooms, because even before the February announcement, He had been planning for a family with the same unsentimental practicality he brought to everything else. A covered porch running the length of the front, facing the long view across the grass. He built it himself with help from Deckard and Calvin and Julio Mendez and Pete Mallory and two older hands who had done construction work before the cattle trade. Preston contributed materials and the use of the ranch wagon for hauling, and spent several Sunday afternoons swinging a hammer alongside everyone else, which increased his standing with the hands considerably. Sarah came out on Saturdays to watch the progress, and when the walls of the kitchen were up, she stood inside the frame and looked at where the south-facing window would be, still just an opening in the boards, and the spring light came through it and fell on her face, and George stood in the doorway watching, and thought that he wanted to remember this specific moment for the rest of his life. "It's exactly right," she said, looking through the window opening at the creek bottom and the cottonwoods. "I told you," he said. She turned and laughed at him. "Did you just say I told you?" "I believe I did," he said. She threw her work gloves at him. He caught them. Julio Mendez, working on the opposite wall, pretended very hard to be interested in the plank he was nailing. The house was finished in late May, 3 weeks before Sarah's due date. They moved in on a Saturday with the help of everyone who had built it, carrying furniture and trunks and Clara's cast iron skillet. She had been persuaded to stay on at the Barlow Ranch, where she was valued and comfortable, but she arrived at the new house with the skillet under her arm as a housewarming gift, saying she had another one and this one belonged here. Sarah walked through every room, touching the walls and the windowsills and the smooth board floors that George had laid himself, with the careful attention of someone memorizing a thing as it happens. She stood at the south-facing kitchen window for a long moment, looking out at the creek bottom and the cottonwoods and the enormous Kansas sky, and George stood in the doorway as he had stood in the frame weeks before, watching her. "We're home," she said. "We're home," he agreed. Their son was born on the 14th of June, 1883, in the room with the east-facing window on the second floor, with Doc Hedges in attendance, and Clara present and George in the hallway being patiently useless in the way of men whose practical competence utterly fails them in the specific situation of their wife being in labor. He paced the hallway for 4 hours, and Deckard Holt, who had ridden out to hear the news and had the good sense to stay in the yard, sat on the porch steps counting the paces from the sound of the floor. When Doc Hedges opened the door and said, "You have a son, Mr. Slater, and your wife is doing well," George went through the door and crossed to the bed where Sarah was propped against 2 pillows holding a bundle of cloth, and he sat beside her, and she looked up at him with exhausted gray eyes and said, "Look." He looked. The baby was red-faced and small-fisted and appeared to have arrived in the world with opinions, and George looked at him for a long moment with a feeling in his chest that was beyond any available word for it, and he said, "Hello," very quietly, and the baby opened its eyes, which were a dark, unfocused blue, and George thought, "There is nothing in the world like this." "He looks like you," Sarah said. "God help him," George said. She laughed, tired and real, and leaned her head against his arm, and he put his arm around her, and she held the baby, and he held them both, and the June morning came through the east window in long gold bars, and the new house was warm and quiet around them. They named him Thomas Henry Slater Thomas for no particular reason, except that it was a solid name that wore well, and Henry for old Henry Barlow, who had not lived to see any of this, but without whose ranch none of it would have come to pass. Thomas was a determined baby who approached eating and sleeping with strong preferences and no particular willingness to compromise on them, which George recognized as a family trait and which Sarah found endlessly amusing. He grew steadily through the summer, watched over by Clara on her visits from the Barlow Ranch, and by Julio Mendez, who had become a regular visitor to the Slater property and who had a gift for holding babies that surprised everyone except George, who had always known Julio Mendez was a man of depth. George had negotiated, through the fall and winter of that year, the the purchase of his first small herd, 40 head of good Texas stock, mixed steers and cows, bought at a favorable price from a driver coming up the Kishom who was willing to sell part of his consignment before Caldwell. He also retained a portion of his stock work arrangement with the Barlow Ranch, running a smaller operation under Preston's umbrella while building his own, which was a practical compromise that suited everyone and which Preston had proposed himself, saying it was better to have George's expertise available to the Barlow operation, even part-time, than not at all. Deckard Holt left the Barlow Ranch in the fall of 1883. He did not go far. He took a position as a hand on a neighboring homestead, which struck everyone as slightly below his skills, until they noticed that the neighboring homestead was run by a family named Colby, and that Deckard seemed to spend a significant portion of his time in the company of the widowed Sarah Redmond, who continued to cook at the Barlow Ranch but whose evenings had become somewhat less solitary than previously. George mentioned this to Sarah one evening in November, with a neutrality that did not fool either of them. "Good," Sarah said, without looking up from her mending. "He deserves someone and my mother deserves someone, and they're both sensible people." "Deckard is occasionally not sensible," George observed. "He's sensible about things that matter," Sarah said. "I've watched him. He's kind to her." She looked up. "That's what matters." George nodded. He had known this. He had simply wanted to hear her say it because she was usually right about people, and hearing her assessments was one of the small satisfactions of his daily life that he had come to depend on. By the spring of 1884, the Slater Ranch, they had not given it a formal name, which George said was unnecessary, and Sarah said was typically him, had grown to 60 head and 2 additional horses. George had hired one hand, a young man from Texas named Russell who was good with cattle and better with horses, and who was quiet and competent and fit the operation without friction. Thomas had learned to walk, which he did with the same determined independence he brought to everything, and which meant the kitchen gate had to be latched at all times, which was George's job, which he performed with a reliability that Sarah said was more consistent than anything else on the property, including the sunrise. Sarah had planted the kitchen garden in the first spring as planned, and it had been, in each subsequent year, larger and better, running along the south fence in a tidy abundance that she managed with the same focused care she brought to everything she loved. She had also started a small herb section along the kitchen wall that she used in her cooking, and in her 3rd year there, she added a flower bed along the porch steps that was purely decorative and entirely her own choice, and which George looked at every morning when he came out for the day with the feeling that the world had arranged itself correctly. She had continued drawing. The sketchbooks had multiplied on the shelf in the parlor, and the drawings inside them were better each year, the landscapes more confident, the detail more assured. George had framed 4 of them and hung them in the parlor, which she had objected to on the grounds that they were just sketches, and which he had refused to argue about, and they hung there still, charcoal images of Kansas grass and creek water and cattle, and one small drawing of a man's hands holding a coffee cup that she did not know he had discovered, and which was his private favorite, and which he never mentioned because he knew it would embarrass her. In October of 1884, she told him she was pregnant again. "How are you feeling?" he asked, because he had learned this was the right first question. "Good," she said. "Better than last time, actually, less tired." "Good," he said, and pulled her into his arms, and she pressed her face into his shoulder, and he held her in the quiet kitchen with Thomas asleep upstairs and the October wind in the cottonwoods outside the window. The second child, born in June of 1885, was a girl. They named her Anna Clara, the second name for her grandmother, who arrived at the Slater Ranch 3 days after the birth and cried again, which she was entitled to. George held Anna with the ease of a man who had learned the holding of babies, and found it to be one of the more satisfying things available to a person, and he looked at her small face with the same feeling he had looked at Thomas with, amplified and specified to this particular small person, who had gray eyes from the first in Sarah's mouth, and a disposition that seemed, even at 3 days old, more philosophical than her brother's. Thomas regarded his sister with 2-year-old solemnity, and then said, with the gravity of a judge delivering a verdict, "Small," and George had to go stand in the hallway for a moment because he was laughing, and it seemed inappropriate to the occasion. The years moved through the ranch the way good years do, not without difficulty, because that was not how any years worked, but with the accumulation of good things outweighing the difficult ones in a way that felt, when George took stock in the quiet moments, like abundance. There were dry summers and late springs and one significant hailstorm in the summer of 1886 that took half the garden and a portion of the barn roof and cost 2 weeks of hard repair work. There was a cattle illness that came through the county the following fall, bovine pleuropneumonia moving along the trail stock, that threatened the herd for an anxious 3 weeks before passing without hitting the Slater cattle, partly through luck and partly through the early isolation measures George implemented the moment he heard the first reports. There were good years for calves and good prices at the Caldwell market, and the slow, satisfying growth of the herd toward something that could genuinely be called an established operation. There was Russell, who stayed and proved himself year after year, and whom George eventually offered a partnership of limited share in the operation, which Russell accepted with a straight-faced dignity that went completely sideways when he went to tell his wife, who was audible from 3 rooms away. There was Preston Barlow, who grew from an uncertain young man from St. Louis into a rancher of genuine competence, and was, by 1887, one of the more respected operators in Sumner County. He never married, which was his business and about which he said very little, but he came to Sunday dinners at the Slater ranch every week that the work allowed, and was Thomas's favorite uncle in the way that adults who do not have children of their own sometimes become, with complete availability and spectacular lack of concern for bedtimes. There was Julio Mendez, who bought his own small piece of land in 1886 and began running cattle on it, and who came to George for advice and got it, and who came to Sarah for her opinion on whether to plant the east field in sorghum or leave it in grass, and got a 20-minute analysis that was, as he reported to George afterward with great respect, exactly right. There was Deckard Holt, who married Sarah Redmond in November of 1885, in the same Caldwell church where George and Sarah had married 3 years prior, and who stood at the front of that church with a straightness and seriousness that George had not seen in him before, and that suggested the occasion had reached him somewhere important. Clara wore a plum-colored dress and carried herself with the complete composure of a woman who has had a hard life and has found, at the end of it, something she did not expect and is profoundly grateful for. George stood beside Deckard as the person closest to a best man, and Sarah stood beside her mother, and the exchange of vows between those two people was something that everyone present felt in a particular way, because the happiness of people who have already known loss is different from the happiness of those who have not. It is more specific, more earned, more quietly enormous. Deckard moved into a small house outside Caldwell, where he took a position as a deputy to the county marshal, which suited him well, and which surprised exactly nobody who had known him long enough. Clara continued her position at the Barlow Ranch through the week and was home on Sundays, and this arrangement was, in all the important ways, the thing that made both of them happiest. George and Sarah's 3rd child was born in August of 1887, another boy, whom they named James. He arrived into a household that was by now fully established and running, and was received by Thomas, who was 4 and a man of the world, with the pragmatic acceptance of a boy who had already processed the concept of siblings, and by Anna, who was 2, with a possessive delight that suggested she considered James primarily her personal acquisition. George watched his family at the dinner table in the warm August evenings, Thomas eating with the serious efficiency of a boy who has things to do after supper, Anna talking with the fluent confidence of a girl who has long since determined that people should be listening to her at all times. Sarah holding James with one arm, and managing her own supper with the other with the competent grace that motherhood had given her. The lamp warm on all of them. The sounds of the ranch quiet outside. And he thought of the man he had been at 19, alone in Texas with his father newly dead and the whole enormous country around him and nothing settled and nothing sure. And he thought, if I could have known, if I could have been told that this is where it was going. He could not have known. He would not have believed it if told. That was the nature of things. You did the work in front of you, and you tried to do it with integrity, and you kept going. And sometimes the going brought you somewhere you could not have imagined from where you started. He thought this privately as he thought most important things, and he looked at Sarah across the table, and she caught his eye with the particular quality of attention she had always had for him, direct, warm, fully present. And she raised an eyebrow very slightly, the eyebrow that meant, "What are you thinking?" He shook his head, nothing specific. She gave him the small smile, "I'll ask you later." He returned to his supper. Later, after the children were in bed, they sat on the covered porch in the August evening, the grass moving in the dark, the creak audible from the cottonwoods, the stars producing their extravagant Kansas display overhead, and the two dogs asleep on the porch steps, a blue heeler named Ketch who worked the cattle, and a yellow hound named Duke who worked nothing and considered it no business of anyone's. Sarah had a cup of tea. He had coffee. This had been the evening arrangement for years and would probably not change. "You were thinking something at supper," she said. "At the table." "I was," he agreed. "Tell me." He looked at the stars for a moment and then at her, the profile of her face in the low light, the red hair that had not changed except for one or two threads of silver that had appeared in the past year and that he thought, privately, were beautiful. She was 27 years old and entirely, completely herself, and had been from the first moment he had seen her. "I was thinking about being 19, he said. And what it would have meant to know this was coming. She looked at him, the warm, clear look. And what was coming, she asked, soft and deliberate, the way she asked things when she wanted the full answer. "This," he said. "All of it, you, the children, the land, the porch," he paused. "The coffee." "The coffee is essential," she agreed solemnly. "It is," he said. She moved from her chair to his, which was a thing she did sometimes in the evenings, settling against him with the easy comfort of years of belonging, and he put his arm around her and she rested her head on his shoulder, and the night moved around them, and the dogs slept, and the creek ran, and the grass bent and rose in the warm summer wind. "I'm glad you came to Caldwell," she said again, the same thing she had said years ago with the same simplicity. "So am I," he said, "every morning." The salt cellar sat on the table in the Slater kitchen, the original glass one from the Barlow Ranch, which Sarah had asked Preston for when they moved and which he had given with the cheerful generosity that characterized him, and it had sat there for years, used every day, unremarkable to everyone who saw it. To George it was something else. It was, when he thought about it, which was not often but with great affection when he did, the smallest possible instrument of the largest possible change. A glass salt cellar on a dining table in Kansas in 1882 passed between a woman with gray eyes who said ordinary things like they mattered and a man who was not afraid of anything except the particular quality of that directness, aimed at him. He had nearly dropped it. He was glad he had not. He was glad for the whole of it. The near drop and the walk and the kitchen garden and the water dispute, and the ring from Werner's back case, and the wedding and the house with the south-facing window and Thomas saying small in the doorway, and Anna declaring ownership of everything she loved and James asleep upstairs tonight with his small fists above his head, and Deckard married to Clara, and Julio with his own land, and Preston coming for Sunday dinners, and Russell with his share. And all of it grown from that one moment at a dinner table when the world had surprised him. He sat on the porch with his wife in the August evening, and he listened to the creak in the cottonwoods and the sound of the wind in the grass, and he thought, this is what building looks like. This is what it comes to. All the work and all the moving and all the years of discipline and the wall and the careful distance, they were not the story. They were the getting there. They were the long walk to the table where someone asked you to pass the salt and changed everything you thought you knew about what you were. He was 34 years old. He was the owner of a ranch with 68 head of good stock and 3 children and a kitchen garden and a covered porch and 2 dogs, and a horse named Amos who was getting old but still had opinions. He had a wife who read everything and drew the landscape and told him the truth and leaned against him on summer evenings, and had known he was kind before he was willing to show it. He was, in all the ways that mattered, exactly where he was supposed to be. Sarah lifted her head from his shoulder and looked at him in the dark and said, with no particular lead-in, in the way she said important things, "I think we should name the next one properly before we find out, if there is a next one. I want to name a boy William." He looked at her. "The next one," he repeated. She had the expression she wore when she was telling him something and enjoying the telling. "Probably February," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "February." "Around then," she confirmed. He looked at the stars. He looked at her. He said, "William is a fine name." She put her head back on his shoulder and he pulled her closer and the porch held them both, and the Kansas night was warm and enormous and entirely, perfectly still. The morning would come early, as it always did. There would be cattle to move and fences to check and rustle, arriving before sunup, and Thomas waking with the sun, and asking what they were doing today, and Anna making her considered announcements about the state of things, and James beginning his morning negotiations regarding breakfast. There would be coffee at the kitchen table, and the light coming through the south-facing window and the garden along the fence, and all of it would be ordinary, which was the finest thing any day could manage to be. For now, the porch. For now, the evening. For now, the man who had once been afraid of a salt cellar, and the woman who had asked for it, and the remarkable life they had built between them on flat Kansas ground under the wide and generous sky.